Mrs. Eleanor Brooks' disappearance from Ridgemore High School began as just another strange, unsettling story told by students and faculty alike. But it was the mystery of her sudden absence that grew into something darker, more chilling, and far more inexplicable with every passing day. Mrs. Brooke was known throughout the school as a kind but serious teacher whose love for literature was both infectious and intense. She spoke of classic novels as if they were living things, cautioning her students that every word carried weight, every phrase held a message waiting to be unlocked. It was her passion, and in a way her obsession. Little did her students know that these words would later take on a hauntingly literal significance. It was a Wednesday when Mrs. Brooke didn't show up for class. At first, no one thought much of it. Teachers sometimes called in sick or had emergencies. But when the principal entered Mrs. Brooks' classroom, his face drained of color and his hands trembling slightly, the students knew something was wrong. "Class is dismissed," he said abruptly. There was no further explanation. Outside, teachers murmured in hushed voices, and a rumor started to circulate. Mrs. Brooke had left without a trace, vanishing from her home sometime during the previous night. Her car was still parked in her driveway, her purse left untouched by the front door, and every single light in her house had been left on. But there were no signs of struggle, no evidence to indicate where she had gone. Over the next few days, the school tried to carry on as usual, but there was an unspoken dread that hung over everyone. A few students noticed things were off in other ways. On Mrs. Brooks' last day, she had been unusually tense, often looking over her shoulder, as if she expected to see something or someone behind her. Her usually neat desk was a mess of scattered papers, some of which bore phrases and strange symbols, cryptic markings that seemed to mean nothing and everything at once. A sophomore named Lydia, who had been in her last class that day, remembered Mrs. Brooke repeatedly muttering under her breath, "They're here. They're already here." Days turned into weeks, and Mrs. Brooks' absence morphed into a ghost story, whispered through the hallways between classes. Then, one afternoon, an unexpected package arrived in the school's main office. The receptionist opened it, revealing a tattered, leather-bound journal covered in strange smudges. Scribbled across the first page in familiar, frantic handwriting was a note that read, "To those who find this, heed the warnings within, for the eyes have been opened." It was unmistakably Mrs. Brooks' handwriting, but no one knew where the package had come from. The journal was immediately taken to the principal, who cautiously flipped through it. Inside were pages of what seemed like jumbled thoughts, poems, and letters addressed to her students. As word of the journal spread, students began to receive letters in their lockers. One by one, the letters appeared, each addressed specifically to a different student. They were filled with strange, disjointed warnings and references to books and stories Mrs. Brooke had taught them. Danny, a student in her English class, was among the first to find a note. His letter contained fragments of a Poe poem, but Mrs. Brooke had marked certain words with red ink, connecting them to form a sentence. "Beware the watcher in the shadows." Another student, Sarah, found a letter in her locker with lines from *Macbeth* highlighted. The phrase, "By the pricking of my thumbs, something wicked this way comes," was underlined several times, as if Mrs. Brooke had left it as a final warning. As these cryptic messages continued to surface, students and faculty grew increasingly uneasy. The letters seemed to predict events, odd occurrences that only added to the school's growing paranoia. One evening, as the janitor was locking up, he heard soft humming coming from Mrs. Brooks' empty classroom. The door was locked, and when he peeked through the small window, he saw no one inside. Yet the haunting melody continued, echoing down the empty hallways, and when he returned to his office, he found a slip of paper on his desk, covered in Mrs. Brooks' unmistakable handwriting. It read, "It's closer than you think." Determined to understand what was happening, Danny gathered a few friends to investigate. They planned to search the school after hours, convinced that something in Mrs. Brooks' classroom would hold the answer. Armed with flashlights and barely restrained fear, they crept into the building one night. As they reached the classroom, they noticed a faint light flickering inside, as if the overhead bulbs were struggling to stay lit. On the teacher's desk lay a single piece of paper, carefully positioned in the center. In hurried, shaky handwriting it said, "It's not safe here. Leave while you can." The boys froze, fear clawing at their throats as they glanced around the room. But before they could act, a sudden chill swept through the air, and they heard soft footsteps approaching from the hallway. Terrified, the group quickly left, their minds racing with unanswered questions. Over the next few weeks, the entire school became a hotbed of rumors and conspiracy theories. Some claimed that Mrs. Brooke had been involved in dark practices, summoning things she could not control. Others believed she had uncovered a hidden truth, something so horrifying that she was forced to flee, leaving behind clues to protect her students. The letters, the journal, the cryptic symbols, they all seemed to hint at forces beyond the ordinary. One by one, students reported seeing strange, shadowy figures lingering near the school grounds at night. Some swore they saw Mrs. Brooke herself, her figure barely visible through the mist, standing just outside the windows and watching them with hollow eyes. The sightings became so frequent that the school had to set up additional security cameras, but nothing ever appeared in the footage. It was as if whatever was haunting the school was only visible to the students who had received her letters. Years later, Mrs. Brooks' story remains an unsolved mystery at Ridgemore High. New students hear of her as a ghost story, a tale passed down to frighten them on chilly autumn nights. But for those who knew her, those who received her messages, there is a lingering sense that her warnings were real, that something did follow her, and that it never truly left. In hushed voices, they say that late at night, when the school is silent and the shadows grow long, you can still hear her voice, whispering the words she left behind, trapped somewhere between our world and whatever lies beyond. Mr. Gregory Marsh was the kind of art teacher students loved. Known for his unconventional teaching methods and easygoing personality, he encouraged his students to find their voices through art. His classroom was a sanctuary filled with eccentric supplies and artwork from past students, a colorful contrast to the otherwise drab high school hallways. But there was something about Mr. Marsh, something in the way he gazed at certain pieces of artwork or the peculiar sketches he kept hidden in his office, that left an unsettling feeling among some of his students. No one could put their finger on it, but rumors of his mysterious past had always floated around the school. It wasn't until a few of his more curious students decided to dig a little deeper that they uncovered the chilling reality of his secret life. One afternoon, after a long art session, Mr. Marsh excused himself to fetch supplies from the back room, leaving the classroom open for exploration. Jackson, a junior with an eye for intrigue, nudged his friends Emily and Sarah. "Come on, don't you guys want to know what's back there?" he whispered. They exchanged glances, a mixture of excitement and fear in their eyes. They had all heard stories about Mr. Marsh's past, a failed artist in New York, a strange disappearance, and rumors of an incident that forced him to leave the city. Their curiosity got the better of them, and they slipped into his private office. The room was dimly lit and smelled faintly of old paint and varnish. Dozens of sketches littered his desk, and stacks of canvases leaned against the walls, covered with cloths. The students began sifting through his things, laughing nervously, until Emily noticed something odd. Among the sketches of landscapes and portraits were disturbingly dark drawings, twisted figures, screaming faces, and shadowy forests where eyes seemed to peer out from the darkness. The expressions on the figures' faces were hauntingly lifelike, almost as if they were captured in the throes of real agony. "What is this?" Emily murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. A creeping dread filled the room as they continued to uncover more unsettling images, each darker than the last. Just as they were about to leave, Sarah's gaze fell upon a dusty journal hidden beneath a stack of old magazines. She hesitated, but Jackson urged her to open it. The pages were filled with entries written in Mr. Marsh's distinct, sharp handwriting. At first the entries seemed ordinary, musings about art, students, and lesson plans. But as they read on, the entries grew stranger, more obsessive. "The eyes," one entry read. "I can feel them watching me when I paint. They see everything." Another entry spoke of a recurring nightmare, a dark figure that haunted him at night, whispering secrets and urging him to paint things he couldn't understand. The words became frantic, his handwriting more erratic with each entry. If they only knew. The art reveals what's hidden in the soul, he had scrawled in one of the final entries. The ink smeared as if his hand had been shaking. The students exchanged worried glances. Jackson tried to laugh it off, saying it was probably just a creative exercise. But the entries seemed all too real, and the desperation in the words lingered like a bad omen. Just as they closed the journal, they heard footsteps approaching. Panic set in as they quickly shoved the journal back in its place and darted out of the office, slipping back into their seats just as Mr. Marsh returned. He eyed them with a strange, almost knowing smile. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said quietly, his eyes locking onto each of them. The three friends shifted uncomfortably, a chill running down their spines. Over the next few weeks, strange things began happening in Mr. Marsh's art class. The room was often darkened when they arrived, with eerie music playing softly in the background. He began assigning projects that seemed innocuous at first, self-portraits, abstract pieces, landscapes, but each assignment seemed to push the students into exploring darker themes. When they painted, they found themselves compelled to create things they couldn't explain, distorted faces, shadowy figures, even entire scenes that felt foreign, as though someone else was guiding their hands. It was as if Mr. Marsh's unsettling presence had seeped into the very fabric of their art. One day, Jackson couldn't take it anymore. Determined to uncover the truth, he convinced Emily and Sarah to meet him at the school late at night. Armed with flashlights, they sneaked into the art room, which felt different in the dark, almost alive with a silent, watching energy. They returned to his office, where they found the journal again, along with a hidden compartment in the desk they hadn't noticed before. Inside were old newspaper clippings detailing a series of grisly murders in New York. Each victim had been an artist, and their bodies had been found surrounded by grotesque paintings that eerily resembled Mr. Marsh's work. As they pieced together the articles, a horrifying realization dawned on them. Mr. Marsh hadn't just been haunted by dark thoughts. He had been investigated as a suspect in the murders, but had been released due to lack of evidence. Each artist who died had been part of his inner circle in New York, part of an underground art community that dabbled in what one article called the dark side of inspiration. The journalists speculated that Marsh had been involved in some kind of occult practice, using his art to summon something beyond human understanding. But nothing was ever proven, and he disappeared soon after the final victim was found. Just then, a shadow moved in the corner of the room. The students froze as Mr. Marsh stepped into the light, his face unreadable, but his eyes filled with a sinister gleam. "I see you found my collection," he said, his voice low and cold. "Art has a way of revealing truths, doesn't it?" The students backed away, terror flooding their veins as Mr. Marsh continued. "The artists I worked with, they weren't just friends, they were offerings of sorts. They helped bring out my most powerful work." He held up one of his sketches, a portrait of a familiar face twisted in agony, Emily's. Before they could react, he continued in a chilling whisper, "Now that you've seen my work, you understand. Art demands sacrifice, and sometimes that sacrifice is permanent." The lights flickered, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to dance around them. Panic surged as the student stumbled out of his office and ran down the empty halls, his voice echoing after them. "Don't think you can hide from the art. It knows where to find you." After that night, Mr. Marsh vanished from the school, leaving only his terrifying sketches and cryptic journal behind. The students never spoke of what they had seen, haunted by nightmares of his ghostly form watching them, urging them to continue the dark work he had left unfinished. And in quiet moments, they would sometimes catch glimpses of his haunting figures, lurking in the shadows of their own drawings, as if his twisted legacy was now a part of them, forever etched into their minds and their art. A class where students could earn an easy humanities credit while hearing strange, compelling lectures about folklore, supernatural occurrences, and forbidden knowledge. Professor Gray's eccentricities, the way he rarely blinked, how he moved silently through the halls, and his unsettling knack for recalling the tiniest details from students' lives, were generally brushed off as quirks. He was simply the weird professor, the one everyone took if they wanted a little scare with their studies. But as the semester progressed, it became clear that there was something far darker and far more dangerous behind his lectures. It began subtly with a lecture on ancient rituals. Professor Gray held up a weathered leather book one night explaining that it contained spells and summoning rites from centuries past. His tone was light, even mocking, but his eyes betrayed a strange reverence. He flipped to a page, running a bony finger along faded lines of Latin text, and spoke almost to himself. This is the key," he murmured. The students leaned in, caught between curiosity and a faint sense of dread. As he read aloud a few lines, the lights in the room flickered. The words hung heavy in the air, filled with a power none of the students could place. Gray stopped abruptly, closed the book with a loud snap, and smiled, though his eyes remained cold. "You see, knowledge is a door. It only opens if you truly believe." After that class, strange occurrences became commonplace. Ellie, a sophomore, found strange symbols scratched into her notebook, ones she hadn't written. Others reported hearing whispers during class, even though no one was speaking. The projector would flicker and show distorted images that didn't match the lecture slides: dark woods, shadowy figures, things that looked uncomfortably close to faces. One evening, Mark, a usually skeptical student, noticed that the professor seemed to stare directly at him during the lecture, his gaze unblinking, his lips moving soundlessly as if reciting something only Mark could hear. Later, Mark found himself waking in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with words he couldn't understand echoing in his mind. Soon, students began digging into Professor Gray's past, but what they found, or rather didn't find, was equally unnerving. There were no records of his degrees, no published papers, and no references to his name in any academic circles. He was simply asterisk there asterisk, his history as shadowy and indefinite as the subjects he taught. When students pressed the administration about his background, they were met with evasive answers. "Professor Gray has been here for a very long time," was all anyone would say, a strange expression of unease in their eyes. It was as if even the faculty feared him. Curiosity grew among a group of students who decided to investigate further, gathering in hushed secrecy to share their discoveries. They noticed a disturbing pattern. Several students who had taken his class over the years had inexplicably dropped out, their names vanishing from the college records as if they'd never existed. When Ellie stumbled across a list of missing persons from nearby towns, her stomach twisted as she recognized two of the names from the old course rosters. Panic set in, but rather than scaring them off, it seemed to pull them deeper, a need to know that overpowered their sense of self-preservation. One night, after class, a group of 5 students stayed behind, determined to confront Professor Gray. As the room emptied and the lights dimmed, they approached his desk, where he sat calmly, hands folded, as if he'd been expecting them. Mark was the first to speak, his voice steady but laced with fear. Who are you really, and what are you teaching us?" Gray's smile faded, replaced by a strange expression, pity perhaps, or disappointment. "What I teach," he said slowly, "is not theory. It is reality, a truth that most cannot handle." With a graceful yet eerie movement, he rose, walked to the classroom door, and locked it. "You see," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "knowledge changes you. Some knowledge cannot be unlearned, cannot be ignored. The things you have begun to see, the shadows, the whispers, they are not merely tricks of the mind. They are visitors." His eyes gleamed with a strange light. "And now that you know of them, they know of you." The students backed away, terror rippling through them as they realized he wasn't just speaking metaphorically. Ellie's hands shook as she noticed shadows flickering at the edges of her vision, dark forms creeping closer, drawn by Professor Gray's words. One of the students tried to run, but the door wouldn't budge, held fast by some invisible force. Gray walked closer, his eyes fixed intently on each of them. "To seek knowledge," he intoned, "is to open doors. Doors that should never be opened. You have chosen to walk through them, and now you must face what lies on the other side." He raised his hands, and suddenly the air grew colder, the room dimmed, and the shadows solidified, taking on horrifying, semi-human forms with hollow, staring eyes. The whispers grew louder, filling the students' minds with ancient words they could not understand, words that clawed at their sanity. Desperate, Mark screamed, breaking free of the paralysis that gripped him. He grabbed Ellie's hand, pulling her toward the door. With a forceful shove, the door finally flew open, and they stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air, the echoes of the shadows' voices still ringing in their ears. They looked back, expecting to see Professor Gray standing in the doorway, but the classroom was empty. There was no sign of him or the shadows that had nearly consumed them. Shaken, they went to the administration the next morning, demanding answers, but found only blank stares. The college had no record of any Professor Harold Gray. When they tried to locate his office, they found an empty supply closet, filled with nothing but dust and darkness. No one in the administration remembered him, nor was there any trace of the night class they had all taken. The students were left with only the haunting memories and the knowledge they could never unlearn. Some transferred, others simply stopped coming to school. Mark and Ellie tried to go back to their normal lives, but the whispers continued, the shadows lingering at the edges of their vision, following them like a curse. Late at night, they would hear his voice in their dreams, saying, "The door is open, there is no going back." To this day, Graymore Community College never speaks of Professor Harold Gray, the night class, or the students who vanished. But those who remain know the truth. Some knowledge comes with a price, and in the quiet hours of the night, when the world is silent, they still feel the pull of that forbidden knowledge, the shadows that gather, and the lingering echo of his voice, urging them to come back, to seek the answers to questions better left unasked. It started as a typical Monday morning at Elmwood High. Mrs. Collins, the 10th grade literature teacher, had taken an unexpected leave due to an illness, and a substitute, Mr. Carl Denton, was brought in to cover her classes for the week. The students barely glanced at him when he entered. Substitutes came and went, and this one seemed no different. Mr. Denton, a gaunt man with sharp features and piercing eyes, introduced himself with a voice as cold as steel. He was dressed in an old, ill-fitting suit, his posture rigid, almost unnatural. But what struck the students most was his unsettling gaze, one that seemed to pierce right through them. As he took attendance, he paused after each name, his eyes lingering on every student as if memorizing them, committing them to some dark mental ledger. From the beginning, Mr. Denton's teaching methods were unusual. He didn't follow Mrs. Collins' lesson plans. Instead, he assigned strange, unrelated stories and obscure poems about shadows, hidden worlds, and cryptic riddles. He told them to read between the lines and seek the truth beyond the words. Every assignment was like a puzzle, filled with eerie instructions and phrases that seemed to have no meaning. The students wrote off his behavior as just eccentric, until they noticed his peculiar habit of never leaving the classroom. He was always there, morning through afternoon, even between periods. Some students swore they saw him lingering in the classroom after everyone had gone home, sitting at Mrs. Collins' desk with a vacant expression. By the end of the week, everyone assumed Mr. Denton would be gone. But on Monday he was there again, standing by the chalkboard, waiting as if he'd never left. "I'll be with you a while longer," he said, a slight, unnerving smile playing on his lips. No one questioned it, assuming Mrs. Collins needed more time to recover. But weeks passed, and then a month, and still Mr. Denton remained. The principal claimed there were administrative issues, preventing Mrs. Collins from returning, but no one could contact her, and her house seemed deserted. Rumors spread among the students that she had moved away or disappeared. Some even whispered that Mr. Denton had something to do with it. Mr. Denton's assignments grew stranger. Each homework was a maze of cryptic questions and odd symbols, asking them to find the hidden path or seek the door beyond. One night, Jenny, a student who had been particularly disturbed by Mr. Denton's lessons, sat down to complete one of his assignments, a poem about darkness and a place between worlds. As she read, the words began to blur, shifting on the page as if alive. She rubbed her eyes, thinking it was fatigue, but when she looked back, there were new lines she hadn't remembered reading before. "The shadows await those who dare to see beyond." A chill ran down her spine, and she threw the paper aside, refusing to finish. The next day, when she handed in her incomplete assignment, Mr. Denton gave her a cold, disappointed look. "It's a shame, Jenny," he murmured. "Not everyone has the courage to see things as they truly are." She felt a sick feeling in her stomach, like he was reading her thoughts. After that, Mr. Denton seemed to take a particular interest in her, calling on her in class, watching her with that unnerving stare that seemed to know far more than he should. She started having nightmares about him, dark, oppressive dreams, where she found herself in an endless maze of shadowed hallways, hearing his voice whispering from somewhere in the darkness, calling her name. Other students began to feel the weight of his presence as well. Brandon, a popular athlete who usually dismissed the class as an easy credit, began experiencing strange occurrences at home. One night, he found his notebook open on his desk, with words scrawled across the page in a handwriting that wasn't his own. "He knows you've seen him." Terrified, he tore out the page, but the words continued to appear in his notes, his textbooks, even on his bathroom mirror. It was as if Mr. Denton's eerie influence had crept beyond the classroom, following them into their lives. One evening, several students gathered at Jenny's house to discuss what they'd been experiencing. They each shared their stories, realizing with horror that Mr. Denton's cryptic messages and strange behaviors seemed to be more than just bizarre teaching methods. The phrases he used, the symbols he drew on the board, the riddles he embedded in their assignments, it all pointed to something dark, something old. One of the students, Mark, mentioned that his grandmother had once told him about rituals and entities from the other side, forces that required invitation, symbols, and certain knowledge to be unleashed. They began to suspect that Mr. Denton wasn't just a teacher, but something else entirely, something far more sinister. The following week they tried to avoid him, skipping class and feigning illness. But Mr. Denton seemed aware of their intentions. Each absence was met with a chilling smile, and he made cryptic remarks like, "You can run, but you can't hide from knowledge." He began appearing in strange places, the library, the cafeteria, even outside their homes, always watching, as if waiting for them to return to class. Panic spread among the students. They had no idea who to turn to. No one in the administration seemed concerned. The principal brushed off their fears, saying they were just stressed from the school year. Desperate, Jenny decided to visit Mrs. Collins' home, hoping she could shed some light on the nightmare they were living. When she arrived, she found the house dark, its windows covered in thick dust. She hesitated at the door, her hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Inside, the house was empty, abandoned, as if no one had lived there for months. In Mrs. Collins's study, she found a single note on the desk. It was written in hurried, shaky handwriting. "Beware the one who walks between worlds. Do not look too deeply, or he will see you too." As Jenny read the note, she felt a cold breeze brush past her, and for a moment she swore she could hear Mr. Denton's voice behind her, whispering her name. She fled, her heart racing, her mind spiraling with the terrible realization that they were dealing with something beyond human comprehension. The next day, she shared the note with the other students, but by then, Mr. Denton seemed to sense their knowledge. He stopped using his usual cryptic words and began addressing them directly, speaking of their place in the grand scheme and how they were chosen to know the truth beyond the veil. It wasn't long before students began disappearing. First Brandon, then Mark. Each left behind only a single page of notes, covered in Mr. Denton's strange symbols and phrases like, "They have crossed over, and the door is open now." Panic seized the school, but no one could explain where they'd gone. The principal, who had always defended Mr. Denton, resigned abruptly, leaving no explanation. But as Jenny and the remaining students tried to report the disappearances, they were met with silence and disbelief, as if no one else remembered Brandon, Mark, or the other missing students at all. One day, Jenny arrived at school to find Mr. Denton's classroom empty. His belongings were gone, his cryptic notes and drawings erased from the board. It was as if he had never been there. But she knew better. She could still feel his presence, his knowledge lingering in her mind, and the shadows that seemed to follow her wherever she went. She never saw Mr. Denton again, yet his voice still haunted her dreams, whispering secrets she couldn't forget, urging her to see beyond the ordinary. Years later, rumors of the substitute who never left became a ghost story at Elmwood High, a warning whispered to incoming students. But Jenny and the few who survived knew it was no story. Somewhere, in some dark space between worlds, Mr. Denton was still watching, waiting for another invitation to return and teach those daring enough to look into the shadows. Mr. Vincent Calloway was not your average history teacher. With his tall, wiry frame and piercing gray eyes, he commanded the attention of any room he entered. Dressed in old-fashioned suits and always carrying a small leather-bound notebook, he taught at Hawthorne High for years, known for his unique teaching style and his fascination with artifacts. He would often bring ancient relics to class: an old Viking amulet, a rusted coin from the Roman Empire, a small dagger rumored to have been used by medieval knights. The objects fascinated the students, and Mr. Calloway would weave strange, eerie tales about each one, his voice dropping to a low whisper as he spoke of curses, sacrifices, and ancient rituals. But what no one knew, at least at first, was that Mr. Calloway's collection extended far beyond the artifacts he displayed in class. His private collection, hidden from prying eyes, was rumored to hold things much darker, things that defied logic, and some students who crossed his path would come to learn the terrifying truth. It started with Emily, a curious sophomore who had always been captivated by history and old stories. She would often linger after class, asking Mr. Calloway about his artifacts and the origins of the strange symbols etched into them. Mr. Calloway seemed amused by her curiosity and would share details with her that he didn't mention in class, details about ancient powers, forbidden rituals, and the kind of knowledge that few dared to seek. One afternoon, he showed her a small obsidian figurine, no larger than a thumb, carved into the shape of a twisted, howling face. He handled it with a strange reverence, warning her, "This one is different. Legends say it's a relic from a forgotten civilization, a civilization that practiced dark rites to commune with realms beyond our own." Emily laughed it off, but the look in Mr. Calloway's eyes was deadly serious. "Do not mock what you don't understand," he whispered, his tone icy. From that day forward, Emily began to notice strange things. At first, it was subtle, shadows in the corners of her room that seemed to flicker, whispers just beyond hearing. Then one night, she awoke to find the figurine on her bedside table. She had no idea how it had gotten there, as she hadn't seen Mr. Calloway since that day in class. Trembling, she wrapped it in cloth and shoved it in the back of her closet, hoping that would end the disturbances. But the whispers continued, growing louder, and each night, the figurine appeared closer to her bed. She tried telling her friends, but they dismissed her as overly imaginative. The next day, she confronted Mr. Calloway, demanding to know what was happening. He simply smiled, a thin, unsettling smile, and said, "Some objects find those they're meant for. The figurine has chosen you." Her blood ran cold as he went on to explain that some artifacts were vessels for spirits or energies that lingered, entities that had long since passed from the mortal realm, but remained tied to the objects they had once inhabited. "Consider it a gift," he said softly, "a doorway to knowledge beyond what you could ever learn from books." Terrified, Emily ran from his office, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something dark had latched onto her life. Emily wasn't the only one. Over the next few weeks, other students started to experience strange incidents. Daniel, the class clown, had once scoffed at Mr. Calloway's stories, laughing loudly when he told the class about a Roman coin he claimed had tasted blood. Shortly after, Daniel found himself plagued by accidents, small injuries, cuts, and bruises that seemed to appear out of nowhere. One day, he tripped in the hallway, and as he lay on the ground, his backpack spilled open, revealing that very coin, now tainted with a smear of his blood. His hands shook as he realized it had been missing for weeks, and he had no memory of how it had ended up in his bag. Others spoke of nightmares, of seeing Mr. Calloway's artifacts in their dreams, glinting in the darkness, as if calling to them. Some dreamed of the objects moving, whispering their names, reaching out with invisible hands. A quiet girl named Lila, who rarely spoke up in class, began sleepwalking, drawn inexplicably to the history classroom late at night. She was found one evening by the janitor, standing by Mr. Calloway's desk, her eyes vacant and fixed on an ancient Egyptian amulet that lay there, her hands stretched out as if in a trance. When asked what she was doing, she simply murmured, "It wanted me to come." The students grew terrified, whispering that Mr. Calloway wasn't just a teacher, but a collector of dark powers, a man who dabbled in things better left untouched. Some speculated he wasn't even human, that he was some ancient spirit himself, bound to the artifacts he so dearly cherished. When one brave student tried to report the incidents to the principal, she was met with a dismissive laugh. But as she turned to leave, she saw a small glinting object on the principal's desk, a silver ring, one she recognized from Mr. Calloway's collection. Her heart dropped as she realized the principal wore the ring proudly, her eyes strangely glazed whenever she mentioned Mr. Calloway's name. As rumors spiraled, a group of students decided they couldn't take it anymore. They planned to break into Mr. Calloway's office late at night and see his collection for themselves, hoping to find something, anything, that could explain the strange events and put an end to them. They waited until the school was empty, slipping silently through the hallways until they reached his locked office door. The lock was old and gave way with a little force. Inside, they found a dimly lit room, its shelves lined with artifacts from all corners of the world, each more sinister than the last. In the center of the room, on a velvet cloth, lay the obsidian figurine, the Roman coin, and the Egyptian amulet, all surrounded by other eerie relics. Cracked mirrors, rusted chains, ancient manuscripts in languages they couldn't decipher. The air was thick with a strange, oppressive energy, and as they stepped closer, they could almost feel the object's malevolent intent. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and Mr. Calloway's voice filled the room. "Curiosity, it's a dangerous thing," he murmured, stepping out from the shadows. The students froze as he looked each of them over, a twisted smile forming on his lips. "These artifacts are more than history," he explained. "They're alive in their own way, holding echoes of the past, spirits, curses, knowledge that's been forgotten by most." He lifted the obsidian figurine, his fingers tracing its howling face with a disturbing gentleness. "But some knowledge demands a price, and you've shown interest." The lock was old and gave way with a little force. Inside, they found a dimly lit room, its shelves lined with artifacts from all corners of the world, each more sinister than the last. In the center of the room, on a velvet cloth, lay the obsidian figurine, the Roman coin, and the Egyptian amulet, all surrounded by other eerie relics, cracked mirrors, rusted chains, ancient manuscripts in languages they couldn't decipher. The air was thick with a strange, oppressive energy, and as they stepped closer, they could almost feel the object's malevolent intent. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them, and Mr. Calloway's voice filled the room. "Curiosity, it's a dangerous thing," he murmured, stepping out from the shadows. The students froze as he looked each of them over, a twisted smile forming on his lips. "These artifacts are more than history," he explained. "They're alive in their own way, holding echoes of the past, spirits, curses, knowledge that's been forgotten by most." He lifted the obsidian figurine, his fingers tracing its howling face with a disturbing gentleness. "But some knowledge demands a price, and you've shown interest. You've invited them in." The lights flickered, and in the dim glow, the students saw shadows shift and morph around them, as if the artifacts were alive, exuding dark energy that began to twist and stretch across the room. One by one, they felt a cold, ghostly touch, a hand on a shoulder, a whisper in an ear. Some screamed, others backed away, but the shadows grew, their forms stretching, clawing, until they surrounded the students entirely. Mr. Calloway's voice echoed over the chaos, calm yet menacing. "Each of you has drawn the attention of an artifact, and now they will be part of your lives, just as they are mine." The students tried to rush to the door, but it was locked tight, as though held by an invisible force. Each artifact seemed to reach out, binding itself to them in ways they couldn't comprehend. Dark visions, shadows that would never quite leave, whispers that would follow them forever. The next morning, Mr. Calloway was gone. His office lay empty, and every artifact had disappeared, leaving only the faint smell of old dust and candle wax. The students who had entered his office never spoke of that night, but they bore the mark of it in their eyes, haunted, forever watching their own shadows for movement, forever aware of the unseen. For years they endured nightmares, visions, and a sense of being watched. Some even claimed they saw Mr. Calloway in the reflections of old mirrors, smiling that twisted smile, waiting for them to discover their fates. And though Mr. Calloway and his collection were gone, the echoes of his artifacts lingered, like dark stains on their lives. New students heard the whispers of those tales, of the teacher who collected dark artifacts. And those who dared to venture too close to the shadows sometimes heard his voice again, inviting them to look beyond history, to seek the secrets that would change them forever. St. Augustus Academy had always been a place shrouded in mystery. Nestled on a remote hill surrounded by thick woods, it was a traditional boarding school with a long history, its sprawling stone buildings echoing with the footsteps of generations of students who had come and gone. By day, it was a typical, if slightly austere, institution. But at night, the school became a different place, a place where shadows lingered in the corners and an eerie silence fell over the grounds. For decades, students whispered about the phantom teacher, a ghostly figure who supposedly roamed the halls after midnight, offering strange lessons to those unfortunate enough to cross his path. Most dismissed the tales as mere ghost stories, but some, the ones who had seen him, knew better. It was October, and the chill of autumn had settled into the dormitories. Henry, a skeptical senior, had heard about the phantom teacher every year, but he'd always laughed it off as a scare tactic used by upperclassmen to frighten newcomers. He prided himself on being level-headed, not easily swayed by tales of ghosts or curses. But this year, things felt different. One night, just after lights out, he noticed a flickering light in the hallway outside his dorm room. Curious, he crept to the door and peered out. At the end of the corridor, he saw a tall, gaunt figure dressed in an old-fashioned, slightly tattered suit. The figure was holding a lantern, casting an unsteady light that barely illuminated his pale, angular face. The man's eyes were hollow, as if they saw through everything and everyone. Henry watched, frozen in place, as the man slowly turned his head. Their eyes met, and in that instant, a strange, cold dread seeped into Henry's bones. He stumbled back, slamming his door shut, his heart pounding in his chest. The following morning, he told his friends what he'd seen. They laughed, joking that he'd finally met the phantom teacher. "He's supposed to give lessons, you know," one of them teased, nudging Henry. "You didn't get your midnight tutoring?" Henry forced a laugh, but he couldn't shake the chill he'd felt. Despite his skepticism, he couldn't deny what he'd seen. Over the next few nights, Henry's curiosity got the better of him. He began staying up, watching for the flickering lantern light. On the third night, it returned, the eerie glow appearing just outside his door. This time, he was prepared. Quietly, he opened the door a crack and saw the figure once again, drifting down the hallway with slow, deliberate steps. At the end of the corridor, he saw a tall, gaunt figure dressed in an old-fashioned, slightly tattered suit. The figure was holding a lantern, casting an unsteady light that barely illuminated his pale, angular face. The man's eyes were hollow, as if they saw through everything and everyone. Henry watched, frozen in place, as the man slowly turned his head. Their eyes met, and in that instant, a strange, cold dread seeped into Henry's bones. He stumbled back, slamming his door shut, his heart pounding in his chest. The following morning, he told his friends what he'd seen. They laughed, joking that he'd finally met the phantom teacher. "He's supposed to give lessons, you know," one of them teased, nudging Henry. "You didn't get your midnight tutoring?" Henry forced a laugh, but he couldn't shake the chill he'd felt. Despite his skepticism, he couldn't deny what he'd seen. Over the next few nights, Henry's curiosity got the better of him. He began staying up, watching for the flickering lantern light. On the third night, it returned, the eerie glow appearing just outside his door. This time, he was prepared. Quietly, he opened the door a crack and saw the figure once again, drifting down the hallway with slow, deliberate steps. Graves were reaching into his mind, pulling out pieces of him. Henry wanted to leave, to scream, but he was paralyzed, his body unwilling to move. Secrets, Mr. Graves murmured, are like ghosts. They haunt, they linger. Sometimes they consume. He paused, his eyes darkening. Some secrets are best left forgotten, but others demand to be known. The lesson continued until dawn, a strange, torturous ordeal that left Henry shaken and exhausted. When the first light crept through the windows, Mr. Graves vanished, leaving behind only the faint scent of chalk and dust. Stumbling back to his room, Henry tried to process what he'd experienced. Was it a nightmare? But as he looked down, he saw chalk dust on his hands, and his notebook, left behind on his desk, was filled with notes in handwriting that wasn't his own. Scrawled phrases like, "they know," and "no escape," and, most chillingly, "see you tomorrow." Henry barely made it through the day, haunted by Mr. Graves's words. He confided in his friends, begging them to believe him, but they laughed, brushing it off as a prank or a hallucination. That night, as the school fell silent, he was again lured by the flickering light in the hallway. This time, his friends joined him, more out of curiosity than belief. Together, they followed the ghostly teacher down the hall, witnessing him enter the same classroom. "It's probably just one of the seniors playing a prank," one of them whispered, though his voice shook. When they entered the classroom, Mr. Graves was there, standing by the blackboard, his expression unchanged. "Ah, more students," he said with a cold smile. "Wonderful. Tonight's lesson is on consequence." The door slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. The room seemed to warp, the walls stretching and darkening as Mr. Graves recounted tales of students from generations past, students who had disappeared, students whose secrets had bound them to the school in ways that defied explanation. One by one he listed their names, his voice echoing with the weight of each soul. The students tried to scream, to run, but the room seemed alive, swallowing their voices, sealing their exit. Shadows stretched across the walls, taking on grotesque, twisted forms. Each one bore the likeness of a student, their faces etched in terror, their hands reaching out as if in desperate plea. Mr. Graves's gaze was relentless, his words drilling into their minds like a curse. "The past is always present," he said softly. "Those who do not learn from it are bound to repeat it." Hours later, the sun rose, breaking the spell. The students were found in the classroom, huddled together, pale and shaking, their eyes wide with terror. No one could explain how they'd ended up there, or why they were unable to speak of what they'd experienced. The only thing they could remember was Mr. Graves's final words, echoing in their minds. "This school is a place of learning, yes, but some lessons are not for the living." After that night, Henry and his friends rarely spoke of what they had witnessed, but they carried it with them, a silent pact born from shared horror. Some left the school early, unable to face the memories, while others simply withdrew, becoming quiet, haunted versions of their former selves. The story of Mr. Graves grew in the whispers of St. Augustus Academy, a cautionary tale for new students who dared to wander the halls after dark. Every year, on the anniversary of that night, students claim to see a flickering lantern in the halls, a shadowy figure moving from classroom to classroom, his lessons unfinished. And those who dare to look closer, who peer into the dim light and see the cold eyes of Mr. Graves, know better than to enter. They understand that some knowledge, some lessons, are meant only for the restless dead, and that the phantom teacher's class is forever in session, waiting for the next student who dares to learn. Mr. Roland Finch was a man of science, or so he claimed. Known for his eccentric personality and intense passion for chemistry, he'd been teaching at Blackwood High School for nearly a decade, though no one quite knew where he had taught before. Students whispered about him, a tall, thin figure with thick-rimmed glasses and a wild, unkempt head of hair, often seen muttering to himself in the dim light of the chemistry lab. His coat was perpetually dusted with odd stains, remnants of experiments whose nature he never fully explained. While the other teachers kept open doors and welcomed questions, Mr. Finch was different. His door was always closed, and he was oddly protective of the lab, keeping students out after hours and carrying a set of jingling keys with a strange attachment. A small vial, filled with a glowing greenish liquid, he wore around his neck. It was an unspoken rule among students not to linger around Mr. Finch's lab after dark. Stories circulated of students hearing muffled explosions, strange smells wafting through the halls, and faint, eerie humming noises that would echo late at night. One rumor in particular held a place in every student's mind, that Mr. Finch wasn't simply a chemistry teacher, but a man conducting experiments of his own, a secret, twisted project hidden behind the guise of academia. Over time, the tales became part of the school's lore, and while many dismissed them as urban legend, others couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Mr. Finch than met the eye. The real mystery began when Sarah, a curious and daring junior, noticed something unusual one evening. She had stayed late for a study group and was packing up when she caught a glimpse of Mr. Finch walking down the hall toward the lab. He moved with quick, furtive steps, glancing over his shoulder as if he feared being watched. Curiosity got the better of her, and she slipped silently after him, her footsteps light. She followed him to the chemistry lab, where he unlocked the door and slid inside, leaving it ajar just enough for Sarah to peek through. She held her breath, leaning forward to see what he was up to. Inside, Mr. Finch's behavior was more bizarre than she'd anticipated. He was moving frantically, gathering flasks and vials, mixing strange powders and liquids that hissed and bubbled in a dizzying array of colors. The air quickly filled with an acrid, almost metallic smell that made Sarah's eyes water. But what caught her attention most was a large glass container at the center of the table, filled with a dark, viscous substance that seemed to pulse with a faint, unnatural light. Mr. Finch leaned over it, whispering to himself, his face lit by the eerie glow. "Almost ready," he muttered, his fingers trembling. "Almost time." A chill crept down Sarah's spine, and she backed away, slipping quietly into the shadows. The next day, she tried to tell her friends about what she'd seen, but most of them laughed it off as a prank or an exaggeration. However, one friend, Ben, a quiet, skeptical boy who loved a good mystery, listened intently. "There's something weird about that guy," he admitted. "Let's check it out tonight. See if we can find out what he's doing." That night, Sarah and Ben waited until the school was empty, sneaking back to the chemistry lab. To their surprise, they found the door unlocked, as if Mr. Finch had been expecting them. The lab was dim, the air thick with that strange, acrid smell Sarah had noticed before. The faint light from the glass container illuminated the room, casting shadows that danced along the walls. Sarah shuddered, feeling as if they were stepping into a different world. They moved cautiously, examining the strange collection of bottles and jars lining the shelves. Each one was filled with strange, murky liquids or odd, powdery substances. Some were labeled with scientific names, while others bore no labels at all, their contents a mystery. Ben picked up one of the unlabeled vials, squinting at the dark, almost oily substance within. "This isn't normal," he whispered, setting it back down. Just as he turned, the light suddenly flickered, and a soft, low hum began to emanate from the glass container on the table. The dark liquid inside began to swirl, forming strange shapes, as if alive. Sarah and Ben exchanged a terrified glance, and in that moment they both knew they had gone too far. Just as they turned to leave, the door slammed shut and the hum grew louder, a vibrating sound that resonated through the walls. "Going somewhere?" came Mr. Finch's voice from the shadows, his figure emerging at the edge of the room. His face twisted in an unsettling smile. "You shouldn't be here," he said calmly, though his eyes held a menacing glint. "Some knowledge, some discoveries, aren't meant for the uninitiated." He stepped closer, his gaze fixed on them with a strange intensity. "Do you know what I'm working on, Sarah? Ben?" He seemed to savor their fear, feeding off it as he began to explain, his voice a mixture of pride and mania. Mr. Finch had, over the years, amassed a collection of rare chemicals and substances, many of which were illegal or ethically questionable. He'd been conducting experiments that went beyond simple chemistry, attempts to bridge the gap, as he called it, between life and something else. His latest creation, the dark substance in the glass container, was the result of years of experiments, a mixture that he claimed could transcend the limits of the physical world. The liquid pulsed as he spoke, seeming to react to his words, growing brighter and more volatile. Sarah felt a surge of terror as he continued, describing how he believed he was on the brink of creating a sentient, living chemical, a substance with its own mind, capable of absorbing and controlling whatever it touched. He referred to it as the essence, his voice filled with reverence as though it were a deity. He turned to them, his expression darkening. "And now that you've seen it, you're a part of it too." The pulsing liquid began to bubble, and with a horror they could scarcely process, Sarah and Ben saw something forming within, a faint shifting shape, almost humanoid, pressing against the glass as if trying to escape. "It's reacting to you," Mr. Finch whispered, his face twisted with fascination. "It knows you're here. It wants to learn." Before they could scream, the lights flickered and the container shattered, sending a wave of the dark, oily substance splattering across the lab. Sarah and Ben backed away, watching in horror as the substance began to slither, pulling itself together in a shape that mimicked human limbs and a face, an imitation of life, warped and grotesque. Mr. Finch's face lit with twisted excitement as he extended a hand toward it, murmuring, "Yes, yes, come to life, my creation." The substance lurched forward, spreading across the floor, moving toward them with terrifying speed. Ben grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her toward the door, but Mr. Finch blocked their path. "Don't you see?" he hissed. "This is a new form of existence. It needs sustenance. It needs you to thrive." In a burst of adrenaline, Ben shoved past him, pulling Sarah out of the lab. They raced down the hall, the eerie hum and pulsing light fading behind them. When they finally escaped, they turned to see Mr. Finch standing in the doorway, his eyes dark with fury, his voice echoing through the empty hall. "You can't run from this. You're marked now. The essence will find you." They barely slept that night, haunted by visions of the dark, creeping liquid and the mad glint in Mr. Finch's eyes. The next morning, the school was in chaos. The chemistry lab had been locked and Mr. Finch was nowhere to be found. Rumors spread like wildfire, some claiming he had left in the middle of the night, others insisting he had never existed at all. But Sarah and Ben knew the truth. They could feel it in the uneasy weight that lingered in their chests, a strange sense of being watched. In the weeks that followed, strange occurrences continued to plague them. Shadows moved where there should be none, and they both began noticing dark stains on their clothes, on their hands, tiny traces of the oily substance that they could never seem to wash away. Sometimes, in quiet moments, they would hear a faint hum, as if the essence were nearby, waiting, watching, biding its time. Though Mr. Finch was gone, the chemistry lab remained closed, locked with a warning posted on the door. Asterisk, do not enter. But Sarah and Ben knew that some secrets, once uncovered, could never truly be locked away. And as they moved through the halls of Blackwood High, they could feel the essence lingering. A dark, watchful presence that followed them like a shadow. An experiment that would never be complete, a lesson they would carry with them forever. Thank you for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe.